Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. In this episode, we will continue our exploration of synesthesia. And today I'll be speaking to Jamie Ward, author of The Frog Who Croaked Blue, Synesthesia and the Mixing of the Senses, one of the most catching titles of a book I have come across. Jamie Ward is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. He completed degrees at the University of Cambridge and the University of Birmingham, and subsequently worked as a research fellow at the University of Sussex between 1997 and 1999, and lecturer and senior lecturer at the University College London between 1999 and 2007. His principal research interest lies in the cognitive neuroscience of synesthesia, although he has published on many other topics, including frontal lobe function, memory, and disorders of reading and spelling. His research uses a number of methods in cognitive neuroscience, including human neuropsychology, functional imaging, EEG, and TMS. His other books include The Student's Guide to Cognitive Neuroscience and The Student's Guide to Social Science. Jamie Ward is the founding editor of the journal Cognitive Neuroscience and is currently president of the British Association of Cognitive Neuroscience. Jamie Ward, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm very glad that you've sacrificed some time to be with me today.
Thanks for inviting me.
My usual first question is why anybody writes a book, and in your case, why did you write on synesthesia? And I would like to know about the source of that interesting title.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So synesthesia is something that's been around or known about for a long time. And I think that this is one of the things that we'll cover. But there was a paper in the 1920s of a young boy who I think was 3 or 4 years of age, who was describing the colors that various sounds made. And the croaking of a certain frog was a blue color, something was red, and so on. So he was just describing the world to him and assuming that everybody else would imagine that frogs croak blue. So that was the title of the book. So synesthesia had been known about for a long time, but it kind of had a bit of a renaissance in terms of people studying it. From the year 2000 to maybe a little bit before that, people were very interested in it. I got interested in it myself. I was having lots of emails from synesthetes, and some of them came out with like fantastic anecdotes, similar to what was described here of the boy describing the frog croaking blue. And I wanted to put some of those anecdotes in a book, but also put them within a scientific context of the senses and what we know about synesthesia, or at least at the time when I wrote it.
And so I'm assuming your interest in synesthesia came after you've actually established yourself as an academic, rather than something you were interested in from the beginning. Is that so?
Correct. So I went through my kind of academic career as a student, a postdoctoral researcher and a lecturer without ever hearing this word or knowingly hearing this word. And it was with a friend of mine, actually, who said that one of his house share friends was, had synesthesia. And I said, "What's synesthesia?" And at the time, I thought, this is so fascinating. I could see other people were starting to study it. And I thought, well, I bet I will never meet a second person with synesthesia, so I need to go and study this. And of course, I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of people with synesthesia over the years.
That's interesting. Back to basics. What is synesthesia? Let's kind of understand what it is in the first place.
So we can define synesthesia as being an extra sensation or experience that's tagged on to that, which most people would have. So for most people, listening to music is a purely auditory hearing experience. But for somebody with synesthesia, they would hear music, but they would also see it. And what they would see would be things like flashes or dancing shapes, or things like this. So it would be abstract. It wouldn't be an image of violins playing. It wouldn't be image of a countryside scene, although you could have those experiences. Synesthetes would have kind of more raw experiences of color, shape, movement, and so on. For other people, when they're listening to my words, they don't just hear my words, they see the words spelled out, like ticker tape. Other people would taste my words. For other people, numbers might trigger tactile sensations, or you can have any real combination of the senses, but some do turn out to be more common.
So it's not you're listening to music and it takes you somewhere where your imagination runs wild. It's not just that. It's
It
actually.
is not just that. So synesthesia is defined as this extra sensation, but it has a number of other properties. So one is that it is very automatic and what we say involuntary. So somebody with synesthesia, it's like when they listen to music, it will trigger an experience and they can't change that experience. If they have a red experience, they can't turn it blue through imagination. They can't unimagine it. It comes kind of automatically involuntary. It happens kind of throughout the lifespan. And yeah, it has these kind of concrete experiences. So it's quite different from imagination, although, of course, we can imagine seeing things when we listen to music. That isn't what synesthesia is.
And what's the hypothesis or current theories behind why some people have synesthesia and I suppose the vast majority don't?
Yeah, so one of the curious things about synesthesia is that if you have synesthesia, it feels perfectly normal to you. And this, one of the reasons for this is because it's something that you have throughout your life. We don't know exactly when it comes on, but people don't have any memory of it just appearing. They typically, although we can maybe discuss exceptions, you don't just wake up and find that you've got synesthesia. So for most people, it feels like a kind of an entirely normal thing. But one of the things that's been known about since its early discovery is that it runs in families. So it almost certainly has it does have a genetic basis. This has been shown now with molecular genetic studies. We don't know exactly what the genes are doing in the brain, but they're obviously changing the way that the brain is wired, the way that the brain functions. And the genes themselves probably have rather broad effects on the way that synesthesia is manifested. And the reason I say that is that although within families you might have a mother and a daughter with synesthesia, that they will disagree on what the colors of things are. So the mother will think that the letter A is red and the daughter might think that the letter A is blue. So it's not that the mother has taught the daughter what it is, but they might even be wildly different. So maybe the mother experiences colors for words and the daughter experiences taste for music. So it's not the case that the particular associations or the broad kind of associations are inheritable or heritable. It is the general tendency to form these unusual experiences, these unusual associations. That seems to be what's herited. Now, why some people would have difference in their genes and others don't, obviously, we can ask that of any kind of genetic difference, and we can speculate on some answers, but genetic diversity is just something that happens naturally, and of course why some genes stay and others go, we could speculate on.
And so I'm assuming this is something that should have an evolutionary advantage if it has persisted so long. Does it have any? Is there any?
Well, one possibility, yeah, exactly. One possibility is that it has an evolutionary advantage. The other option is that it doesn't have an evolutionary disadvantage, that it's somehow kind of cost neutral. But what we do find when we do research on people with synesthesia is that they are unusual in other ways aside from their synesthesia. So they have differences in the way that they remember things, that they've got good memory on objective tests, they have good measures on objective measures of creativity. They make different lifestyle choices in terms of occupations. They might go into creative industries, graphic design, arts for hobbies. They think in visual ways. So yes, we could all imagine or visualize our last holiday, but for a synesthete, visualizing their last holiday would be a lot more realistic, a lot more full of experiences in a way that others don't. So it might be that synesthetes occupy a particular niche within the population around certain kinds of gifts or abilities to do with memory and imagination and creativity.
And I mean, you talk about the genetic or the familial forms, but you also wrote about synesthesia having several other causes: sensory loss, drug-induced. How does that come about? Is it an epigenetic phenomenon or something?
Yeah, so the question of how acquired synesthesias relate to the kinds of synesthesia that I was just talking about that persist throughout the lifespan, we don't honestly know. But the two ways in which people acquire synesthesia, one is through sensory loss. So when people go blind or other senses, and what you might find is that they start to see things through sound. And that you can even do this experimentally by blindfolding somebody for a week. So they literally have no light perception. And what you find is that for some people, as they listen to the radio, they see flashes of white light with the rhythm of the voice. Or as they move their arm in front of their face, they see a white bar. But of course, their eyes are not seeing it because their eyes are covered. It's their brain that's seeing it and generating these experiences. So the way that we think about what's happening in acquired synesthesia is that there would be latent pathways in the brain that connect sound and vision that are always there, but the act of losing your vision then magnifies those. It's like an amplification. It's trying to switch vision on from the inside out to compensate for the lack of vision from the outside in. That would be one way in which we can think of acquired synesthesia. It's not clear that people who have the developmental synesthesia have any real visual problems. On every test we give them, they seem to have good perceptual abilities. So this idea of kind of compensation by, seeing things from the inside out doesn't seem to quite work true for those with developmental things. It seems to be more differences in the way that the brain is wired from the genetics onwards in development. So the other kind is drug-induced synesthesias, and this would be obviously your classic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD. Again, people can study this experimentally. There are certain legal ways in which you can do that and ask people, does music trigger colors now? And it does during the experience, but not beyond it. And of course, we know how these drugs work in terms of neurobiology. We know which receptors in the brain psychedelics are activating. We know what kind of pathways. What we don't know, again, is how that links to people who have this throughout the lifespan. Is it the same? Do they have differences in the same receptors that are implicated in psychoactive drugs? We don't know that. So there are lots of kind of dots to connect between these intriguing findings that is kind of for the next generation of researchers to do, really.
Interesting. We talk about people having a sixth sense when they feel as if somebody's behind them. But apparently you talked about there may be up to 33 senses rather than just the conventional 5. And that's because of did we know this because of our understanding of synesthesia?
That's not quite okay. So basically what synesthesia tells us is that our senses are more connected than people give credit for. That is true in other people as well as that. But I suppose it also tells us that our senses are not exactly what we're taught in high school as well, that it's a lot more complicated than that. And actually, what I was getting at when it's like, how do you count the number of senses, is how you actually define them. So we can talk about sensory organs. So our eyes are, different from our ears, so we can count them this way. But even if you go in the eyes, we've got different kinds of receptors. We've got those for color, we've got our rods and our cones. And similarly for other kinds of things, for taste, there are different receptors. There are hidden receptors as well. So, in classical neurology, Sherrington reports things like proprioception. So all of our joints and our arms, they're stretch receptors that indicate the position of our limbs. But this isn't there in our kind of popular discourse. It's often referred to as the sixth sense. So the question is, what is it that we're counting here? Is it the sensory organs? Is it the receptors? Is it the number of experiences that we kind of have? And I don't think we can really give an answer to that, or the answer we give depends on the precision of the question that we give. So basically, yeah. And of course, when we talk about senses, so our eyes and our ears are clearly separate organs, but the information from the eyes and the ears are all talking the same language. When we're in the brain, a visual signal is just the firing of neurons, an auditory signal is just the firing of neurons, and there are no real chemical differences between an auditory and a visual neuron. So at that point, all the senses is just, neurons going bing, bing, bing. Again, what's the story there?
Okay. I will not open the philosophical can of worms. It looks like it's
I think that's very exciting.
But I mean, one of the things that you highlighted was that vision is the commonest synesthetic experience rather than, say, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. Why is that? Is it because it takes a lot of the brain substance, or is it?
That would be the answer is nobody knows. I mean, the fact that vision is, as you say, one of the largest kind of cortical areas. This could be one of the reasons. Other people have speculated that things like color, as opposed to vision in general, is perhaps more late evolving, and it's not quite as modular in the brain as other kinds of systems. People have made these sorts of speculations, and the answer is we don't know. But of course, we are counting other kinds of synesthesia all the time. That maybe they are more common, and we just aren't looking in the right places. But this is, again, one of the mysteries that we don't really know why some types of synesthesia are more common than others. The idea is that the broad idea is that synesthesia reflects the kind of inherent structure of the brain. So, for example, one reason why letters and numbers might be colored is that in the brain, the part of the brain for recognizing letters and numbers is next door to the part of the brain involved in seeing color. So the neuroanatomy of the brain kind of forms some constraints on the kinds of synesthesia that can emerge. But why vision and not hearing? That kind of question is a little bit harder to pin down.
Something for the next PhD student to look at. And then you mentioned the issue of color, and one of the things you pointed out was red seems to dominate, isn't it, over the other colors? Are you more likely to have red than other colors?
No, that's so basically, I know what you're getting at here is that if you put two synesthetes together, they will disagree. They will have this fun kind of argument as to what color the letter A is. And so if you put a group of 100 synesthetes together, then what you will find is that synesthetes will agree more often than not on what color things are. So for the letter A, for example, that's more likely to be red. Other colors aren't necessarily more likely to be red. The letter O tends to be either white or see-through, not orange. So you might imagine that O in English would be associated with the color orange, less so. So basically the associations are variable, but they are not completely random. And synesthetes tend to agree that some things are more likely to be red, some things are more likely to be white. And we do know why this is, and sometimes it's to do with the shape and sometimes to do with the sound. So we can take 3-year-olds who basically are illiterate. They don't know, what the shape of a letter A refers to and so on. And we can give them the shapes and say, what color do you think this is? Or what color you're going to look at? And they're more likely to say that the letter O is white than black or other colors. The letter C is more likely to be yellow and so on. And we know this is to do with the shape because if we show them the shape, they choose the synesthetically more likely color, whereas if we just say the sound of the letter, we don't get that. For other things, the sounds might matter, and it might depend on whether you're an English speaker or an Italian speaker as to how you connect letters and sounds together. But in general, there is some structure and agreement amongst synesthetes about the colors that things are.
And some people see some of these letters as masculine or feminine and give them personalities as well. Where is that coming from?
Well, again, this is kind of what I regard as the fringes of synesthesia, because, what does it mean that something is male or female or personality? At this point, you're not talking about a crossing of the senses or extra sensory things. It's almost like some other kind of association. But it is true that these kinds of associations or types of synesthesia are more common in the traditional types of synesthesia. They're more likely to be had. One way of thinking about it is that synesthetes have differently wired brains in a whole kind of range of domains, not just for colors and numbers, but in terms of other things. This might be why they come across as being more creative or able to form associations, but it might be that they also then generate things that nobody else kind of gets, that are almost, is it really helpful to think that letters and numbers have male, female personality? I'm not sure it does, but it's kind of a bit of a byproduct of this way of thinking, of forming novel, unusual associations that it's unclear that it's helpful, but it's just part of their style of thinking.
Interesting. And you talked, of course, about this spatial anesthesia, which is, I suppose, seeing these numbers and letters in space. You also said time can be a form of spatial anesthesia. In what way does that manifest?
Yeah, so this is one of the most common types of synesthesia, and this is that when you think of sequential concepts such as numbers, or by time, I actually mean days and months. So there are things like calendar time. Or it can be historical time, like years, like 1820 or something like this, that people actually position them in parts of space. So it might be that the number 1 is here, 2 is there, 3, 4, 5, up to 10. But it might be that December's here and July is back there. Or if you're thinking of historical timelines, it might be that the Second World War is up here and the dinosaurs are kind of back down there. And, you've almost got this kind of world history, but in this idiosyncratic visual timeline. And people report this as being useful for memory. That they can kind of position appointments or, use it to kind of divide things up, to put things in order, basically.
And to quote you, said many synesthetes claim that they can reduce their synesthesia by ignoring it and enhance their synesthesia by attending to it. So that suggests some voluntary control over, is it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so that slightly contradicts obviously what I said earlier, and that synesthetes report that they haven't really got control over it. And what I kind of mean by that is that synesthetes, they can't control the nature of the experience, so whether something is red or blue or green. What they can do, or the way that I would think about it, is things like you can't control seeing things in your peripheral vision, but you can choose whether you ignore it or notice it. So your peripheral vision is always there, but the extent to which it is noticeable or reportable is kind of a little bit down to you. And we can think of maybe synesthesia as being the same thing. Or the other analogy that I give to people is that if you're looking through a shop window, you can look through the window or you can look at the reflection on it. But it's not that you are creating one experience voluntarily. Both are there simultaneously, but to some extent you are kind of heightening one at the expense of the other. So this is the way in which I describe it, is that synesthesia is kind of always there, but it's not always noticeable. It's not always at the forefront of experiences, and people perhaps differ in their ability to tune into it or not be distracted by it.
So can it be a nuisance then?
And some people might find it a nuisance. Some people kind of have it as a constant kind of background thing. For others, like with the taste, some words are so intense and some words are weak. So it might just be you've got a background of weak taste, and all of a sudden you get this taste that's just like bang, and then that will be distracting because it stands out from the rest of the other tastes, which are weak.
Interesting. You gave the example of Edgar, 3 years and 7 months old, and his mother noticed that he had colored hearing when he said, "What is that big black noise? And what is that little white noise?" This kind of babble babble, is this something that many families ignore as kind of just a child playing while they're actually experiencing synesthesia?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I mean, I think that the whole kind of social cultural history of this is really interesting as to how parents would report this. So I've certainly had many emails, not so many now, but in the past saying that people talked about this at school and they were told by their parents or the teacher never to mention this again, because being different was just unacceptable. I'm now getting emails from parents who are saying, "Oh, this is very interesting. Some are concerned, some are just fascinated. But again, some might be dismissive, either that they don't believe it, or they just think it's some weird imagination that they'd rather not hear about. But yeah, how people respond to this, it's going to differ from family to family, but it's also going to differ from culture to culture. How open are we to the idea that people can experience things differently, and actually that being different is not always a sign of pathology? Could this be okay? This is going to differ in time and place.
So, I mean, Edgar is the same boy who saw the frog croaking blue, isn't it? I was going to ask how people with synesthesia deal with these extra layers of perception, but I think you probably answered it by saying that it's for them, it's a normal thing. They're not, we are the ones that see it as an extra thing to.
Yes. Well, what's very interesting is that when you start asking synesthetes about what it's like to kind of listen to music and so on, often they just turn the tables quite quickly and say, well, what is it like to listen to music for you? And I say, well, you just hear music. And they say, well, what's that like? And it's like, I don't know what the answer to that is. So there is this kind of element of a barrier between my private experience and somebody else's. You can attempt to dialogue, but there quickly becomes limits as to where that dialogue can go.
Interesting. I was fascinated by the way the history of this science of synesthesia kind of went up and down over the years. You talked about people like George Sachs, Edward Corners. Why was it that at some times there was so much interest in it and then it waned off and then comes back? What was the reason for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's when synesthesia was kind of first documented in the 19th century, there wasn't much skepticism about this, actually. It was before that, there'd been a whole set of things that weren't synesthesia, but that were kind of equivalents of. So Newton, for example, believed that there was a physical law that linked together sounds and colors, that there would be some kind of way of mapping between them. And of course, there isn't. They're different. Sort of one is vibrations, the other's electromagnetic, and so on. But people have then kind of created things like color organs that do this. So there was kind of a cultural or scientific openness to the idea that you could move from one sense to another. And there was anecdotal cases that are probably untrue of blind people touching surfaces and being able to perceive yellow and so on. They might have been synesthetes, but who knows what was going on. But basically, there was kind of an openness to these unusual experiences. You mentioned somebody called Edward Cornaz, who gave the first name to synesthesia, and he called it hyperchromatopsia. And again, his interest in this was that he thought this might be to do with the eyes rather than the brain. So I think it was the 1790s that Daltonism was reported. So again, this was the idea that some people don't perceive colors in the same way as others. It's color blindness, as we would call it now, obviously to do with changes in the retina, although that wouldn't have been known at the time. And the idea was that maybe synesthesia is like this. So color blindness had been already documented, but maybe synesthesia was like something like this. So again, synesthesia was kind of accepted because people understood about color blindness. They'd understood about Newton and color organs and things like this, musical organs. So there was this kind of openness and interest in this. And really in the 20th century, it kind of died out because people were less interested in first-person perspectives. What we've been talking about is the idea that, I got a private experience that's different from yours. Either people, it's not that they didn't necessarily believe that, but they thought it was scientifically trivial. The reason that I think that this sound is blue is because I must have learnt that association with it. So all it is that, I can be different from you, but that doesn't have any fundamental scientific truths. It's just that I've got a different history to you. So it's trivially obvious that these things can happen. And this was obviously behaviorism and Skinner and these sorts of things, that the brain's a blank slate. So we can all differ one from the other. Who cares? It's trivial.
and then a dinner party in suburban North Carolina in February 1980 changed everything. That's when the real scientific study of synesthesia started? What happened then?
Yeah, so this was a neurologist called Richard Cytowick, who was invited to a dinner party by somebody called Michael Watson, who I think was in one of his apartment blocks. And basically, Michael was cooking a chicken dish. And he said something like, this chicken dish needs more salt, more seasoning, because the chicken needs more points on it. And then Richard Cytowick, obviously, as a neurologist, was very interested in this and said, what do you mean that the chicken needs more points? For him, every taste was like a shape. So the taste of chicken would be maybe like a sphere with jaggedy bits on that he could kind of see and kind of feel. It wasn't clear to me what sense this was. He kind of almost feels it on his arms, but whether it's a visual or a tactile experience or a bit of both. But anyway, this is the man who tastes shapes. Richard Cytowick wrote a book on this in which he did a good job in kind of looking at the history of synesthesia, which had kind of, as I've just described it, which had kind of fallen out of people's knowledge. It wasn't being taught in universities. It wasn't really in anybody's head anymore, except if you were maybe a history scholar or something like this. And again, he documented this. He reported multiple kinds of synesthesia. And again, as soon as you go on the radio with this, then people start to kind of come in. So again, he'd built up an interesting cohort of stories of people with synesthesia.
Interesting, just from a chance observation, I presume.
Absolutely.
And then Simon Baron Cohen got interested as well. And that was another curious incident. What happened?
I think that this was an advert in a psychology journal of somebody describing their experiences and effectively saying, will somebody test me? So again, it was somewhat fortuitous that he did that. And his big contribution to this was that basically, how can you prove that this is real? Can we have some kind of quantifiable test of synesthesia? So what he did was what's called a test retest consistency, that you would say to somebody, what color goes with the number 5, what color goes with Tuesday, or whatever it is, and then you could repeat this, say, a month later or several months later, but you could have a control group who you did that with as well. So you're not just testing your synesthetes, you've got a control group, and people would say, well, I don't know what color the number 5 is, but Simon Baron Cohen would say to them, that's fine, just guess a color or choose a color that you think you will remember. And then what you find is a month later that people without synesthesia are about 30% accurate in getting the same color that they said originally, whereas synesthetes typically are above 90%, close to 100%. So then you can take an individual, look at their score on this very simple measure and see, are you closer to the control mean or the synesthete mean? So in a way, it's kind of like having an objective ruler in which you could say, this person is more likely to be a synesthete, this person is more likely to not be a synesthete. And this is something that we still do to the day. I mean, obviously, there are fancier tests using brain imaging and so on, but this is as discriminating as anything else that we can do to find synesthetes.
So those 30%, do they have subsynesthesia? Are they latent synesthetes?
Well, this is a good question. Yeah, so it's not 30% of people. It's that if you give somebody, say, 30 letters, maybe 10, they will get the same colourful. But what is interesting here is that, like I was saying before, is that some of the colours are like what synesthetes would give. So the letter A is more likely to be red. The letter O is more likely to be white than orange. And again, some of these people who claim not to have synesthesia are tuning into these rules. So they're not at chance in the way that a computer would be. They're above that, but nor are they as good as a synesthete either.
Interesting. One of the things that I found interesting was the way synesthesia can dominate people's lives. And one was your subject, Sharon, who you said names her children based on her synesthesia. and choose their partners based on synesthesia? How does this?
Well, this is, yeah, I mean, I haven't done a survey to see how common this is, but I've heard this from quite a lot of people that their names matter. So I know that one of the people I've worked with extensively tastes words, that he couldn't be friends with somebody who had a really disgusting tasting name, or if he was, he would have to give them a nickname that kind of changed this. Yeah. People have even changed their own name or the spelling of their own name. So there was a famous case of somebody called Sarah. So the typical spelling here is Sarah in English, but she changed the spelling of the name to Cera because there was something about the colours of the letters that were more appealing there than the original spelling of her name. So again, these are quite big changes for people to make, big life decisions that most people don't change their names. Quite an unusual thing to do. They don't choose their partner based on the name or choose based on tastes or colours. So again, it does go to show that synesthesia comes across as quirky. Yeah, it's not something that needs to be cured, but actually, if you are a synesthete, it does impact on your life. It can impact your choice of career. You've got a different kind of cognitive skill set. It can impact, the names you give to the people around you, including the name you might give to yourself if you were given a free choice.
I suppose so. So we talked about all the advantages of synesthesia: creativity, good memory. Are there downsides? Are there negative things that come along with synesthesia?
Well, some people with synesthesia can find it somewhat overwhelming. Often they kind of fit their environments to suit them. So, it might be that they don't listen to the radio when they're driving. Is that is that a negative, or is it just a quirk? It's because then people will adjust things to suit their things in a way that's not necessarily disabling in that sense. There is a whole kind of literature looking at what goes hand in hand with synesthesia. So is synesthesia linked with other things that a clinician might diagnose? And there is evidence that synesthesia is more common in people with autism. There is some mixed evidence that synesthesia and anxiety might go together. There's no evidence actually of a link between synesthesia and depression or synesthesia and schizophrenia. So it seems that there might be these interesting links with clinical entities, with some more than others, which again might be to do with the way that the brains of synesthetes are wired, or there might be genes in common between synesthesia and autism, for example, maybe to do with finding the sensory world kind of intense or overwhelming, or other things to do with the way that the brain develops.
And is there an opposite of synesthesia? There are conditions like aphantasia, where there's hyperphantasia. Is there an opposite of synesthesia? Those who just sound the opposite?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. I'm not sure I would call it the opposite of synesthesia, but I do 100% understand where you're coming from. So people with aphantasia don't have visual images. So if you ask them to imagine their last holiday, they'll say, I can remember my last holiday, but I do not see it. I don't imagine it. So certainly synesthetes do have, on average, good visual imagery. Actually, synesthetes do span the whole range of imagery, and some synesthetes actually have aphantasia. And what they would then say is that for me, the number 5 is a light green, but I don't see the light green. I just know it's light green. So they have, even the nature of the synesthesia might kind of fit with this kind of continuity of imagery. So synesthetes on average have better imagery, but in reality, they do span the full imagery spectrum.
Interesting. And perhaps my last question before I go into the general questions at the end. Mirror touch synesthesia. Is that, I understand that's very rare. Surely that must be something that is distressing if you are going to feel so much empathy.
Yes, so mirror touch synesthesia is where people, if they see touch like somebody doing this, they would say, yeah, I feel something on my cheek. I feel pressure. I feel something that is like touch.
Yeah.
They would say it's automatic. They they don't just experience it when I ask them, they would have other anecdotes. Typically, they would also then have some pain. So if you see somebody kind of trapping a finger or, slipping with a, whatever, something sharp, they would typically report feeling something that was unpleasant. And yes, you're right. This is one type of synesthesia that often people don't like having. Again, it's not that it's always bad. So somebody with mirror touch, if they see somebody having a massage or something like this, or being stroked on the head, this is very it feels very nice to them. They like this sort of thing. But yes, you're right. That can be somewhat intense and unpleasant.
So what 3 lessons would you want a reader to take from the book? What kind of behind the back of your mind?
Yeah, I'm to reiterate some of the points that I've already kind of said. I think our private reality is somewhat relative. So my experience of the world can be fundamentally different from yours. And again, I don't think that this is a trivial thing. I think the fact that science can actually prove that, and it's not just conjecture, I think is actually fundamentally very interesting. So that would be the first one, is about, the nature of our inner realities. I think that the other thing that I would say is that the unusual experiences in synesthetes are accompanied by unusual minds and brains. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily pathological or that there's a problem with those. But I think over the years, it's been a bit of a myth that synesthetes are just like everybody else, apart from their synesthesia. And the more we test them on personality, creativity, other things, they're not just like everybody else. They are different. They're a different subset of people within the population. So that would be my second point. And then my third point, I guess, comes to, what are the sensors? What are the sensors there for? And then they're not just kind of our passive kind of input. Our sensors kind of are the building blocks of our imagination, of our memory. And so perception is really part of our cognition. And in a way, synesthesia is kind of telling us that as well in a different way. And that would be the third point.
Interesting. A different concept of neurodiversity then, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. Yes. I wouldn't be against kind of putting synesthesia in with neurodiversity. Synesthetes themselves are unsure whether they want to be part of this group or not. But ultimately, these are differently wired brains with different phenotypes, different skill sets, different problems.
We've talked about the unknown so far. What's the major uncertainty in the field of synesthesia, would you say?
I think that we have lots of the pieces of the jigsaw there, but we don't have all the pieces slotted together. So we know synesthesia runs in families. We know it develops early. We know that the synesthetes have difference in their brain wiring, but we don't really have the details of the story. We don't even know what the genes are. We don't know what the genes do in the brain. We don't know whether, if we can find these genes, what would they do in animals, for example? There are all these other questions which we're just scratching the surface of. So I feel as if we've got lots of parts of answers, but we haven't got the big picture, not completely nailed, or not in a way that joins everything together. And that's what I would like to see happen.
And are we kind of near understanding it, or is we're talking about kind of a long-term future before we really unravel synesthesia?
I think we can get there. I mean, one of the projects I'm working on is, a large data set of brains of people with synesthesia. So these are MRI images rather than physical brains. But we've collected over 100 of those. Yeah, it's not a massive sample, but actually it's the largest sample there is. But people can keep adding to that. My 100 brains aren't going to go away. So, the numbers are only going to increase. And I think with modern science, which is all about pooling our resources, sharing data, larger and larger samples, sharing data from different countries, that actually we kind of have the tools and we have the resources to start to get at this. So I think it's not just our scientific understanding that will change. I think our approach to science is changing, and these two things in concert are going to be what pulls things together.
Interesting. Well, that's a positive note for the future. And are you writing any books, or have you written any other books on this topic? Or
no, I haven't. I still publish lots of papers on it, and I would like to do another book on synesthesia and kind of update the field.
yeah.
So I think my core thinking about synesthesia has remained relatively constant, but actually, there is a lot more things coming out there, and I would very much like to do that.
Okay. And finally, any books you would like to recommend to listeners, either on synesthesia or the brain or anything, actually?
Yeah, there were a few that I kind of, thought about. One was David Eagleman, who's written a lot of popular science books. So one is The Brain, The Story of You, but he's a good science writer who understands kind of the cutting edge of, neuroscience and has worked on synesthesia himself. V.S. Ramachandran, his older book, Phantoms in the Brain, is very much about, unusual experiences, some from neurology, some from neurodevelopment. Again, somebody with an interest in synesthesia, but who really brings the field to life. And then I've always been a fan of Oliver Sacks. He was somebody who got me kind of interested in psychology in this kind of area. He's not known for his research in synesthesia, but the way that he talks about science and the brain and the link between neuroscience and first-person experiences is very much at the heart of what I think about. And I would recommend his book, Hallucinations.
Okay. That's okay. Most people probably have heard about the man who mistook his wife for a hat.
I would recommend that as well.
Okay.
Hallucinations is one of his more modern books, and I think it relates well to this topic.
Okay, I think I'll go and grab myself a copy of it. Jamie Ward, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm very grateful. And to my audience, thank you for watching or listening. If you found it enlightening, do grab a copy of Jamie's book. And after that, have a look at my own book called Surfing the Brain. And for more of the hard sides of neurology, you might want to check my online database called Neuro Checklist. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the podcast, why not subscribe to the YouTube, Spotify, or iTunes channels? Until then, thank you very much. And Jamie Ward, I'm very, very grateful for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.